A husband named Martin, who thought he had everything: a loving wife, a stable home, and a close family bond. But beneath the surface, a shocking secret was tearing his world apart. Julia, his wife, and Daniel, her own brother, were hiding something that would shatter everything Martin believed. It wasn't just any secret. They were having an affair. This story isn't about stolen kisses or broken vows. It's about betrayal that led to bloodshed, a crime that turned love and family into something dark and deadly. One night, Martin found out the truth, and his heart filled with rage and pain. In a moment of anger, he made a decision that could never be undone. Instead of walking away or confronting them with words, he chose violence. Within a few minutes, the home they shared turned into a crime scene. Julia and Daniel lay lifeless, victims of Martin's anger and heartbreak. What drives someone to this point? How could a man, once a caring husband, transform into a killer because of love's betrayal? The police arrived, and the small neighborhood was shaken by the horrifying scene inside Martin's home. Friends and neighbors couldn't believe it. Martin was always the calm, hard-working man they'd see every day. The investigation that followed uncovered the darkest sides of each person, involved secrets that no one ever suspected. As we start this tragic story, we'll walk through the details of what really happened that night and the chilling reasons behind Martin's decision. Get ready to see how love, trust, and betrayal can push a person to the edge, leading to a crime that no one could have ever imagined. The story begins in a small, quiet neighborhood where Martin and his wife Julia lived together in a modest, two-story home. To everyone around them, they seemed like an ordinary couple. Martin worked long hours, and Julia was seen in the neighborhood, often talking to her friends or doing errands. Their life appeared to be peaceful, and Martin seemed like a devoted husband. But as with many things, the surface didn't reveal what was actually going on inside their home. Over time, Julia began spending more time with her brother, Daniel. They had always been close, but lately they were seen together almost daily. They would go for coffee, run errands together, and sometimes even go for long drives. To the people around them, it seemed like siblings simply bonding. Martin didn't think much of it at first, but eventually he began to feel uneasy. Julia would leave the house without saying where she was going or when she'd be back. She often seemed distracted and didn't show the same interest in their marriage as she once had. Martin tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was wrong kept growing. One evening, Martin came home early from work. He noticed Julia and Daniel talking closely in the living room, their faces serious, and they stopped speaking as soon as he entered the room. There was an awkward silence, and Julia quickly made up an excuse to leave the room, with Daniel following soon after. That was the moment Martin's suspicions turned to something stronger. He didn't have proof, but he sensed that there was a secret between Julia and Daniel that was meant to be kept from him. Martin began watching their behavior more closely. He noticed Julia would often leave the house at unusual times, claiming to be going to the store or to meet a friend, but she would take longer than seemed normal. One evening, Martin decided to follow her. She drove to a nearby park where she met Daniel. They sat together on a bench, speaking in hushed tones, looking around as if they didn't want to be seen. Martin stayed at a distance, observing, trying to understand what he was witnessing. Julia and Daniel's body language was tense, and they looked more like a couple sharing a private moment than siblings simply spending time together. Martin's suspicions grew into a sense of betrayal. Something wasn't right, and he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Days passed, and Martin's mind was consumed with questions and doubts. He could barely sleep, and his appetite disappeared. He felt trapped in his own home, living under a cloud of suspicion. The once peaceful environment now felt like a place of secrets and lies. He tried asking Julia about her recent behavior, but she brushed off his questions, claiming he was overthinking things. This only fueled his anger and frustration. One night, Martin found himself unable to sleep. He sat in the darkness of the living room, waiting. Around midnight, he heard footsteps. Julia was sneaking out, assuming he was fast asleep. Martin stayed silent, letting her leave. After she was gone, he decided to follow her once again. She drove to Daniel's apartment and went inside. Martin waited outside, each passing minute making him feel more betrayed, until finally he couldn't take it anymore. He walked up to the door, his heart pounding, a mix of anger and heartbreak flooding his thoughts. He knocked, and after a tense silence, Daniel opened the door, surprised to see him. Julia appeared behind Daniel, and for a moment there was only silence. Martin looked at them, and they could see the hurt in his eyes. Without saying a word, Martin stepped back and left. That moment left him feeling hollow, realizing that his worst suspicions were not just thoughts in his mind, they were real. The days after that encounter were tense. Martin distanced himself from Julia, barely speaking to her, avoiding eye contact. He spent most of his time away from home, not knowing how to handle the situation. He felt his trust shattered, not just in Julia, but in everything he believed about family and loyalty. Julia tried to talk to him, but Martin shut her out, holding on to the pain of betrayal. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Martin overheard Julia talking on the phone with Daniel. Their conversation was quiet, but he could make out enough to understand that they were talking about their feelings for each other. He could hear her laughing softly, sounding happier than she ever did around him. That was the moment his heartbreak turned to anger. He felt as if the people closest to him had destroyed his world, and he didn't know how to cope. Fueled by his emotions, Martin confronted Julia that night, demanding the truth. Julia tried to deny it, but Martin's persistent questioning broke her down. She admitted to the affair with Daniel, revealing the hidden relationship that had been taking place right under his nose. Martin was devastated, feeling like his entire life had been a lie. His anger reached a boiling point, and he couldn't contain it anymore. In a fit of rage, Martin left the house, his thoughts consumed by betrayal and hurt. He wandered the streets, unable to think clearly, feeling as though he had lost everything. He didn't return home until the early hours of the morning, his mind still reeling from the revelation. The following days were a blur of anger, silence, and distance, as he tried to decide what to do next, unable to see a way forward. As Martin tried to go about his daily life, the betrayal he had uncovered continued to eat away at him. He couldn't shake the images of Julia and Daniel together, or the way they'd hidden everything from him. The anger, humiliation, and sadness began to turn into something darker. He stopped speaking to Julia altogether, avoiding eye contact and finding excuses to leave the house. Every time he saw her, he felt the weight of her lies, and it made him feel as though he had no control over his own life anymore. At work, he struggled to focus. Every small reminder of Julia sent his mind spiraling, picturing her with Daniel, laughing, sharing moments he thought were reserved for them alone. Martin's once steady demeanor started to crumble as his emotions turned into a rage he couldn't manage. Over the next few days, Martin began keeping a closer eye on Julia's actions, waiting to catch any further proof of her betrayal. He started keeping track of her outings, watching as she'd leave at odd hours, sometimes in the evening when he was home. Each time she left, he felt his frustration grow. He began to wonder how long this had been happening, how many lies she had told him, and how much he had missed. The anger was a storm brewing inside him, pushing him closer to his breaking point. One evening, Martin followed Julia again, keeping a safe distance as she drove out to meet Daniel. This time she parked in an unfamiliar area, a bit further from their usual spots, as though they were trying to avoid being noticed. Martin parked his car a few blocks away, walking closer to where he could see them. He observed from a distance, hidden in the shadows, and watched as Julia and Daniel spoke in hushed voices. They looked around, checking their surroundings, which only confirmed to Martin that they knew what they were doing was wrong. His mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts, each one darker than the last, and he could feel his grip on his emotions slipping. After that night, Martin was filled with a mixture of numbness and anger. He couldn't remember the last time he felt peace or happiness. All he could think about was Julia's betrayal. At home, he would sit in silence, lost in thought, as Julia moved around him, trying to act as though everything was normal. But Martin could see the guilt in her eyes, even if she didn't say a word. He was waiting, almost expecting her to confess, to come clean about what she had done, but she never did. Her silence made it worse, adding fuel to the fire of anger burning within him. The breaking point came one night when Martin overheard Julia on the phone with Daniel. She spoke in a soft tone, her voice filled with an affection she hadn't shown him in a long time. Martin listened to every word, his body tense with rage as he realized how deeply their affair had gone. It was as if every painful emotion he'd been holding back finally snapped, and he felt himself reaching a decision he'd been avoiding. That night, he barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, thoughts he had never believed he could have. The next day, Martin's demeanor changed. His silence became colder and his gaze sharper. He had made up his mind about what he was going to do. His anger had reached a point where he no longer felt like himself, consumed by betrayal and resentment. He watched Julia closely, waiting for the right moment, planning his every move. He wasn't thinking about the consequences, he only thought about making her and Daniel pay for what they had done to him. That evening, Julia prepared to leave again, as she often did. She didn't know that Martin had decided that this would be the last time. As she gathered her things, Martin stood silently in the background, watching her with a calmness that felt strange, even to him. He felt detached, as though he was simply following through with something that had been decided long ago. Julia left the house, unaware of the dark intentions Martin held. He waited a few minutes, giving her a head start before following her once again. This time he knew where she was going, and he knew what he would do when he got there. His mind was set, his emotions locked away, replaced with a cold resolve that drove him forward. When Martin arrived, he saw Julia and Daniel together, laughing as though nothing in the world could touch them. For Martin, this moment felt like the ultimate betrayal, a final insult that pushed him over the edge. The sight of them together, happy and carefree, was the last thing he could bear. He walked up to them, his footsteps steady, his face unreadable. Julia and Daniel looked up, surprised to see him, and in that moment they knew that everything had changed. Martin confronted them, his voice low and calm, but with an intensity that hinted at the storm raging inside him. Julia tried to explain, but Martin was beyond listening. The anger he had bottled up exploded in an instant, his actions driven by a rage he could no longer control. The confrontation turned violent as he lashed out, releasing all the pain and betrayal he'd felt for so long. After the confrontation with Julia and Daniel, Martin felt a rush of emotions that he couldn't control. The anger and betrayal had reached a point where he felt numb to everything else. It wasn't just a matter of trust anymore to him, it was as if everything he had built was destroyed. As he faced them, he realized he no longer saw Julia and Daniel as family but as people who had wronged him in the worst way possible. He stood there, watching their expressions change from shock to fear, as they understood the depth of his rage. In those moments, Martin felt a sense of power, as though he was finally in control after all the lies and deceit. The argument escalated quickly. Julia tried to calm Martin down, her voice shaking, her hands raised as if to protect herself from what she could see in his eyes. Daniel, too, tried to reason with him, but Martin's mind was set. His thoughts were a blur, each one clouded by his need for revenge. It was no longer about resolving anything, he was there to end it. He moved closer, his focus solely on them, feeling as if his emotions had taken complete control over his actions. Martin grabbed a nearby object, something he hadn't planned or thought about. He swung it, and the moment it made contact, he felt his anger turn into something unstoppable. He no longer felt like the man he once was. Instead, he felt a surge of anger and release as he saw the fear in Julia's eyes. She backed away, stumbling, but Martin didn't stop. His actions were guided by the betrayal that had shattered his life, each movement driven by the resentment he'd held inside for so long. Daniel tried to intervene, stepping between Martin and Julia. Martin turned his focus to him, remembering every moment of suspicion, every lie, and every time he had seen them together. He attacked Daniel with the same intensity, unable to see anything but the betrayal he believed they both deserved to pay for. To him, this wasn't just an outburst, it was justice for what they had done to him. His actions were ruthless, each strike fueled by the pain and loss he'd been holding on to. As Martin continued, the reality of what he was doing began to settle in. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by his heavy breathing. He stood there, looking at Julia and Daniel, now lying motionless, his mind trying to grasp the reality of what he'd done. It was as if he had woken up from a trance, suddenly aware of the destruction he had caused. His hands were shaking, and he felt a hollow emptiness in the place where his anger had once been. The house, once filled with memories of family, was now a scene of tragedy and finality. In the moments that followed, Martin felt the weight of his actions press down on him. The rage that had driven him disappeared, leaving only regret and shock. He looked around, seeing the damage he'd caused, realizing the consequences that would follow. For the first time, he understood that his life would never be the same. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and there was no way to escape the reality of what he had done. Martin left the house, his mind blank, struggling to process everything. He wandered aimlessly, feeling detached from his own actions, as though it had been someone else who had committed the crime. The streets were quiet, and he felt as if he were the only person in the world, lost and broken. He couldn't bring himself to return home, knowing what awaited him there. The once familiar surroundings now felt foreign and distant, as though he had been separated from the life he once knew. He found himself in a nearby park, sitting alone, the silence of the night surrounding him. His mind replayed the events, each moment sharper and more painful than the last. He knew he couldn't hide from what he'd done, that the truth would come out. The gravity of his actions settled on him, and he felt the overwhelming weight of guilt and fear. The betrayal he had felt seemed insignificant now, overshadowed by the tragedy he had created. Martin realized that his life, Julia's life, and Daniel's life were all destroyed in a single night, and nothing could change that. As the hours passed, Martin remained there, lost in thought, unable to move or make sense of his own actions. He knew that he would have to face the consequences, that there was no escape from the choices he had made. The anger and betrayal that had once driven him were gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness and a sense of finality. In that moment, he understood that his life would never return to what it once was. The crime he had committed had left a scar that could never heal, a reminder of a night that changed everything forever. Martin finally gathered himself, standing up slowly, knowing that he couldn't stay hidden forever. He walked away from the park, each step heavy with the weight of his actions. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew that his life was now defined by a single, irreversible moment. The darkness that had consumed him left behind a silence, a void that he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. The road ahead was uncertain, but he understood that he could never escape the truth of what he had done, and he would have to live with the consequences of that night, alone with his thoughts and memories of a life shattered beyond repair. In the early morning hours, as Martin walked away from the park, he felt the weight of his actions settling in. The streets were empty, and the quiet around him felt like a reminder of the finality of what he had done. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts tangled and chaotic. He knew he couldn't hide from what had happened. The reality of his crime was something he would have to face, but he wasn't ready to confront it just yet. His mind was clouded with regret, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The betrayal, the anger, and the violence had left him drained, feeling as if a part of him had vanished along with Julia and Daniel. Eventually, Martin found himself sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, trying to process everything that had happened. Hours passed, and as the sun began to rise, he knew he couldn't avoid going back home forever. The world around him was beginning to wake up, people starting their day without any idea of the events that had just unfolded. For a moment, he wished he could turn back time, undo everything, erase the pain and the violence. But deep down, he knew it was too late, and he was left to carry the weight of his choices. When Martin finally returned home, he felt like a stranger in his own house. The silence inside was overwhelming, and every room seemed haunted by memories of Julia. He looked around, seeing the traces of their life together, the photos on the wall, her belongings scattered throughout the house. It all felt surreal, as though he were trapped in someone else's life, unable to recognize anything familiar. He walked through the house, each step heavy with the knowledge of what had happened, unable to escape the guilt that followed him from room to room. In the hours that followed, Martin tried to keep himself composed, but the reality of his actions was impossible to ignore. He found himself constantly looking out the window, waiting for the inevitable knock at the door. He knew that sooner or later, someone would come looking for Julia and Daniel, and questions would begin to surface. As he sat alone, he replayed the events in his mind, each moment etched deeply into his memory. He knew he couldn't escape what he had done, and the guilt weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the destruction he had caused. By midday, news of Julia and Daniel's absence had started to spread. Friends and neighbors began to notice that something was wrong. Julia hadn't shown up to work, and Daniel's friends hadn't heard from him. Concern grew, and people began asking questions, calling to check on them, wondering why they hadn't been seen. Martin felt trapped, each phone call and knock at the door sending waves of fear through him. He tried to keep calm, but he knew that the truth would soon be uncovered. As the day wore on, the police were notified about Julia and Daniel's disappearance. Officers arrived at Martin's house, asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened. Martin struggled to maintain his composure as he answered their questions, but he felt the walls closing in. Each question was a reminder of the crime he had committed, and he felt as if he were being pulled deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. He knew that lying would only delay the inevitable, but he couldn't bring himself to admit the truth, not yet. The investigation continued, and the police began to search for clues about Julia and Daniel's whereabouts. They spoke to friends, co-workers, and neighbors, gathering information, trying to understand the last moments before their disappearance. Martin watched as the investigation unfolded around him, feeling a mix of fear and guilt. He knew he had brought this upon himself, but he was unable to stop the events that were now spiraling out of his control. Each day brought more questions, more scrutiny, and Martin found himself trapped, both by his own actions and by the investigation that was closing in on him. As days passed, the police grew suspicious of Martin's behavior. His reluctance to answer certain questions and his distant demeanor did not go unnoticed. Officers began to probe deeper, questioning his relationship with Julia and Daniel, asking about their recent interactions, looking for any sign of conflict. Martin felt the pressure mounting, and he knew that his carefully crafted facade was beginning to crack. He tried to stay calm, but he could feel the truth slipping closer to the surface, unable to remain hidden any longer. The police obtained a warrant to search Martin's house, looking for any evidence that could explain Julia and Daniel's disappearance. As they moved through each room, inspecting every corner, Martin felt his heart pounding, the reality of his crime pressing down on him. He watched as they searched, feeling as though his entire life was being unraveled before his eyes. He knew they would find something, a clue he had overlooked, something that would lead them to the truth. In the midst of the search, an officer found bloodstains in a hidden corner of the house. The discovery sent shockwaves through the room, and Martin knew that his secret had been uncovered. The police began to treat the investigation as a homicide, no longer looking for missing persons but for the truth about their deaths. Martin sat in silence, unable to deny what was now clear to everyone around him. The weight of his actions was finally fully upon him, and he knew there was no escape. With the evidence mounting, Martin was brought in for questioning. He felt numb, the gravity of his crime bearing down on him, each question a reminder of the irreversible actions he had taken. As he sat there, he realized that his life was no longer his own, that everything he had once known was gone. The betrayal, the anger, the violence, it had all led him to this moment, where he would have to face the consequences of his choices, with no way to turn back. As Martin sat in the interrogation room, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The walls seemed to close in, the silence in the room amplifying the turmoil inside his mind. The detectives across the table asked him questions, each one pulling him further into the reality of what he had done. At first, Martin tried to maintain a facade, answering in short, controlled responses. But the officers saw through him. They pressed harder, reminding him of the evidence, the bloodstains, the phone records, the accounts from friends and neighbors. Martin could feel his carefully built defenses beginning to crumble. The detectives laid out the sequence of events they had pieced together. They explained that they knew about the confrontation with Julia and Daniel, and they had enough evidence to charge him. As they went over every detail, Martin's mind flashed back to that night, each memory vivid and inescapable. He felt himself sinking into the reality of his actions, no longer able to hide behind anger or denial. The truth was out in the open, and he realized that the story would unfold with or without his cooperation. His silence would not change the outcome. The detectives were prepared to close the case with him as the suspect, and Martin knew there was no way to escape. After hours of questioning, Martin finally broke down. The weight of his guilt, the betrayal, and the consequences he faced collided within him. He began to recount the events, his voice low and steady, as he explained how he had found out about Julia and Daniel's betrayal, how he had followed them and discovered the truth he had been dreading. He described the confrontation, each word bringing him closer to the moment when he had crossed the line he could never step back from. As he spoke, he felt the numbness taking over, his words becoming mechanical, as if he were watching someone else's life unravel. The detectives listened as Martin admitted to the crime, detailing each step that led him to that final act. He spoke of his anger, his sense of betrayal, and the overwhelming emotions that had clouded his mind. In that moment, he saw himself through the eyes of the detectives not as the man he once was, but as someone driven to a violent act by his own despair and rage. He realized that his story would now be defined by that one night, a tragedy brought on by the choices he had made in a fit of anger. When Martin finished speaking, the detectives took down his statement, confirming every detail. They had everything they needed, and he knew there would be no mercy or understanding for what he had done. The consequences were unavoidable, and the sense of finality settled over him like a heavy blanket. He felt hollow, as though a part of him had died along with Julia and Daniel. There was no going back, and he would now face the reality of his actions, stripped of excuses or justifications. In the days that followed, Martin was moved from the interrogation room to a holding cell, awaiting trial. The news of the crime spread quickly, and the story became a source of shock and disbelief in the community. People who had known him as a quiet, hard-working man struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the crime he had committed. Friends and neighbors spoke of his once stable life, the love he had for Julia, and the mystery of what had led him to such a dark place. The betrayal, the anger, the tragedy, it became a story people would talk about for years, a warning about how love and jealousy could twist into something deadly. As the trial approached, Martin faced the full force of the legal system. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his confession left little room for doubt. He sat through each day in the courtroom, listening as the prosecution laid out their case, bringing forward witnesses, showing evidence, painting a picture of a man who had allowed his emotions to drive him to a violent end. Martin's defense was minimal, his guilt was clear, and even he no longer tried to argue otherwise. He felt himself drifting through the proceedings, each day a reminder of how his life had unraveled. Finally, the trial came to an end. The jury returned with a verdict, and Martin was found guilty. The judge handed down his sentence, and Martin felt the weight of his punishment settle over him. He knew he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done, trapped by the choices he had made in a single moment of fury and betrayal. As he was led from the courtroom, he felt a strange sense of calm, as though he had finally reached the end of a path he had set upon long ago. The anger and pain that had once consumed him were now replaced by a quiet resignation, an acceptance of the life he would now lead behind bars. In the months that followed, Martin adjusted to his new reality. The walls of his prison cell became his world, a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. He thought often of Julia and Daniel, replaying the events over and over, haunted by the choices he had made. The betrayal he had once felt now seemed distant, overshadowed by the regret that lingered in every moment of his new life. He knew that he had lost everything: his freedom, his family, his sense of self, all because of a decision made in a moment of anger. As time passed, Martin's story became just another tale of crime and consequence, a reminder of how quickly a life can change. For him, each day was a repetition of the last, a life marked by the memory of his actions and the knowledge that he would never escape the weight of that single night. His story, once filled with love, hope, and family, had become a story of loss, of anger, and of a life forever defined by a crime that could never be undone.